We are going to be talking today about some ways we can use reading comprehension strategies to learn about nonfiction text. Does anyone remember what nonfiction means? Dylan.
Nonfiction means a true story.
True story. So we're going to be reading, we're going to be thinking of our science text. We're going to be reading other books that might remind us of our science books, and maybe other nonfiction stories we've read and reading before too. And we're going to use some strategies to learn about how to understand the story better. So let's think about some ways we've already talked about in class that help us understand nonfiction stories. What are some things we do that help us understand nonfiction? Frankie?
Captions and pictures.
Good. We look at captions and we look at pictures. How do those help us learn?
They help us learn because, like, if you didn't know what they're talking about, you can look at the picture and it will show you what it was talking about, or you can look at text.
Perfect. If you are a little confused by what you read in the paragraph, sometimes the picture can help you understand it better, and the caption explaining the picture. Dylan?
Actual photos.
You look at photos. Good. Because then you can see what it looks like in real life. Okay? Allison, any ideas?
You can look at what the surroundings are around the picture, like the surroundings.
Okay, so photo details too. Okay, good. Is there anything about the text itself that could help us understand the story better? Zach?
I was going to say graphic aids.
Graphic aids? Okay, like, so not just pictures, but what are some other graphic aids an author might put in a nonfiction book?
Like, there could be a bar graph or just a tally chart.
Let's think of how the words are organized in nonfiction too. Okay? Think at the top of a page if you're going to start reading about a new topic. Dylan?
Headings.
Headings can help you. Good. These are all strategies that we've talked about before for nonfiction text. Now, I want to talk to you about another strategy we've used, but not so much with nonfiction. We've used it mostly with fiction stories. So I want to talk about text-to-text connections. Does anyone remember what a text-to-text connection is when we've been thinking about fiction stories? Frankie?
Like, if you read a book, like about something, and then you read another book and it's like kind of like it, like you can raise your hand and say, like, I read a book that's kind of like it.
Yeah, you're reading and all of a sudden it sparks your memory. Like maybe I read something that was similar to that before, or that reminds me of something before. Now we've used that a lot with fiction or fake stories, right? Do you think that using a strategy like that could also help you read a nonfiction story, Allison?
Yes, and you can also use text-to-text connections with your life too, because something that happened in a story probably happened to your life before.
Yes, text-to-self connections would remind you of your life. And like if you're learning about a frog in a science book, right? Maybe you saw a frog that grew from an egg to a tadpole to a frog, and that could help you.
Pet frog.
Good. So you could have some text-to-self connections. Today we are mostly going to focus on text-to-text. And we're going to think of them with non-fiction stories, unlike we usually do with fiction stories. So let's pretend that I'm online and I found an article, which really did happen. I went online and I found this article called "What Are Fossils?" It was at Kids Know It Network by Brandon Guillemin. Hopefully I said that right. And anyway, though, I found this article and I was reading it, and I was just going to model for you. Does anyone know what model means? I don't really mean I'm going to model. Right, Frankie?
Model means it's going to show you.
I'm going to show you. I'm going to demonstrate. So when I read this article, I really did have some ideas pop into my head. So I was just going to kind of share with you what I was thinking about. It said when animals or plants die and may fall into the mud or soft sand and make an impression or a mark in the dirt, the body is then covered by another layer of mud or sand. And over time, the body falls apart and is dissolved. The mud or sand can harden into rock, preserving the impression of the body and leaving an animal or plant-shaped hole in the rock. This hole is called a mold fossil. If the mold becomes filled over time with minerals, the rock is called a cast fossil. Now, when I read that, I thought, this sounds familiar. And then I thought about our science textbook the other day when we read the heading, Animals from Long Ago and Today. And it reminded me of how fossils, most fossils anyway, are not the actual bone of the animal. Instead, what happened is the mud, the sand, the rock piled and piled and piled over millions and millions of years, and it made a mold, okay? And so that's where we get most of our fossils. Now, there were other examples in our science book, and when I was reading the article, I stumbled upon this photo. And when I saw this photo, I had another text-to-text connection. I instantly remembered,
It looks amber.
this looks familiar.
It looks like amber.
It does. It reminded me, I had the same exact thought, Allison. When I saw this, I thought, this reminds me of the amber, the photo that the author in our science textbook chose to use to show us what amber would look like if a spider, it was a spider here, it's a different kind of bug, but in our science textbook, it was a spider that had crawled into the sap, and then over years and years and years, the sap hardened into amber.
Like a cockroach.
Okay, so I just wanted to kind of remind you, too, that there's other things that might remind you, not just the text, but maybe the captions remind you. Maybe the pictures remind you of another book. Maybe the headings remind you of another book. So I just kind of wanted to get you thinking about those types of things. Now, do you think that when I read this article and in my mind I had these memories of other books I read, do you think that helped me understand the story better, Frankie?
Yes.
Absolutely. Do you know why?
Because if you read the article, then like if you have a science test or something, then you can, if you read the story, it'll probably remind you of the story.
Sometimes the more you read something, the better you remember it. So maybe I am taking a test or writing a paper or whatever, and maybe I'm not remembering the exact same from the exact thing from the science book, but maybe I'm remembering details from this story too that could also help me learn. Very good job. Now, what I'm going to be having you do in a minute is I'm going to have you read a story. I have a lot of different choices, and I'll show you this in a minute. I'm going to let you pick. And then you're going to fill out a connection stem. So that should adjust in just a moment. So I'm just quickly going to show you, if I had the story Fantastic Frogs, and I'm not going to do the whole story, but I'm going to show you a couple pages when I read of something that reminded me of something else. So first of all, there was this page here, and it said, maybe all the frogs you've seen are brown like bark or leafy green. Now when I read this, I thought, that sounds familiar. And what it reminded me, you guys already know what it reminded me of, don't you? Mm-hmm. Zach, what did it remind me of?
A simile?
Okay, because it looked like like bark or like leafy green. That's true. But what book do you think it reminded me of? Remember, we're thinking of books that it reminds us of. Dylan.
Or science text.
This again reminded me of the science text because the science text talks about camouflage, right? So I have a connection to our science text. Because the author, and if you want, you can even say the author's name. Robinson is the last name. Oops. The author, Robinson, was talking about if I wanted to, I could even use a science vocab word. How animals, you say it with me.
Adaptation.
Oh, that's the other word I was thinking. I've heard someone say camouflage.
Adaptation.
And I heard someone say adaptation. So I can say how animals use camouflage to adapt, like in our science book. Is the science book the only thing you can make connections to? Frankie, you're saying no?
No.
No. For example, maybe I'm reading this page about the life cycle of a frog, and I see the eggs, okay, and I see how the tadpole's growing, and I see how it's changing, and then if I went further, it would show me even more. Now, I once read a book that was called From Tadpole to Frog. Okay, and these pages reminded me of that. So could I still use that for connection?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, if you're reading anything that reminds you of another story we've read, maybe we read it in reading class, maybe you read it independently. Any memory that you have when you're reading a nonfiction book, you can make connections to all sorts of stories, okay? So I'm going to give you guys some time. You guys are going to pick your own book. Let me just switch this back. You guys are going to pick a book of your choice. You're going to read it independently, and you're going to fill out one of these plats. There we go. So, let me just real quick, last slide. Okay, so it's your turn to make the connections. You're going to fill it out on the plot graph, and then we're going to come back and discuss it. So think about how the story you are reading reminds you of other books you've read, and just remember it could be any kind of text. It does not have to just be your science text. Okay, Haley, go ahead. Okay, boys and girls, now that we've had some time to work independently, let's talk about some of the connections that you made while you were reading your independent reading book. Dylan, first, can you tell me what book you were looking at?
Well, I was looking at Animal Ways of Life, and I had a connection to a dinosaur book I read.
Oh, great.
I just forgot the title.
That's okay. So you read that in your life, at home, or independently? Okay.
And because on one page it told about carnivores and herbivores, and the dino book said carnivores have sharp teeth, and herbivores have flat, and also said that in the dinosaur book.
Good, good. So Dylan heard some vocab words even. Wow, those are some pretty hard science vocab words. Herbivore and carnivore, and he remembers reading those in another dinosaur book. That's awesome. Frankie?
I also picked Animal Ways of Life.
Okay, yeah, a few of you did. That looked like a good one.
I had a connection to my science project of vertebrates and invertebrates because there's a heading of animals without a backbone.
Perfect. So you're connecting text that you've actually written yourself when you were doing a research project, and you're thinking of the heading about vertebrates and invertebrates. I love that you're noticing those connections with headings. Zach, good thought.
I also picked Animals Ways of Life.
Good.
And on one page it told what animals need, and it reminded me of the last lesson of science. And the last lesson of science is like, part of it was like what animals need.
All the different things that animals need. Good. So you were remembering that when you read that
another
book.
one is I saw the word trait in my sentence, so I connected it to this lesson, and they have different traits to help them.
Good. All the different traits that help the animals adapt. Very nice. Now, can I borrow this book, Allison?
Sure.
Allison looked at the book that I kind of briefly looked at earlier, Fantastic Frogs. And then, Allison, what kind of connection did you think about?
I got two connections in.
Great.
I have a connection in science. I'm learning about camouflaging. The book tells me that frogs do camouflage.
Ooh, good expression, too, when you're reading that.
And toads are huge. I watch animal shows like Animal Planet, and it said that they are. Some can be about that big.
Okay, so you had a text-to-world connection, too, where you were reminded of something you saw on TV about frogs. Great. And then, Haley, you were reading a book called With Love, right, about Jane Goodall. What kind of connection did you have while you read that book?
I had a connection, it was because there's chimpanzees in Jane Goodall.
Yeah.
So, I just made a connection, and
yeah, we read a story in reading last year in 2nd grade, right? Watching in the Wild, and it was about Jane Goodall's adventures in Gombe National Forest and what she learned about chimpanzees. So Haley, while you were reading that, you thought about Jane Goodall and the experience she had there from our reading story last year. That's awesome. Great memory. All right, guys, we're all set. I love how you guys told me what you were thinking about when you read and how you were able to connect what you read in those books with other things you've read before in your life. Great job.